Oh, I'm going to change this so that I can see whether we've got other folks joining us. Yeah, I've done it once, but you can do it again. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I have taught this given this talk, lecture, discussion at DU to both freshmen and seniors, nobody in between. It was either a freshman seminar or an advanced seminar at the end when people needed sort of a capstone sort of thing. And one of the biology, or actually taught chemistry, he would teach his class, and he invited me in to give the introductory lecture before he taught a whole course on bioethics. And so, so I know that it can be done within about 50 minutes, because that's about how much time I had. And I've done it both. I did it before COVID and during COVID. And of course, before COVID, I didn't have slides, and everything was in person. And then during COVID, it was all on slides, and I didn't have the advantage of being able to write anything down. So now this is true hybrid. Yes. I haven't done it this way. So those two piglets there, the color, which you might not see as well in here as you might if you're online. You know, it's a very, very artificial pink. You would see, and obviously yellow, and that's not done with a Sharpie. They were engineered to be that color. And so my point is, just because we can, should we? How do we make these kinds of decisions? And all of that. And so I want to start, and if you walked in, like a couple of you did just a minute ago, and I do this in class, so I know how long it takes. I'd like to read this little article as a way to start. And this is about 12 years old, but the article is about 12 years old, but that doesn't make much difference. The issues are still the same. And Mike, I have linked to this article in the e-news. So if you don't, if you haven't read it, you'll have a chance to go back and see. I'll just refer to it a little bit as we go on. So go ahead, take some time to read about Benjamin Button Mouse.
There will be more.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Okay, they're coming in. This is just to prime the pump. You were one of those A students who read it before you came here.
Well, Jimmy printed it out and put it on top of the newspaper. So I had to read it first this morning. That's very engineering. Yes. Well, he's an engineer. I knew he wasn't my hands.
Another minute or so. course, when I teach this, or when I give the lecture, I have to find out a whole lot about the students, so I'm not doing that here. What's their major?
That's right.
Fashion.
I think the pictures are interesting with today's
Okay,
message.
so if this treatment were available to you, would you want it? And why or why not?
If I had the disease, if I had.
Well, if you could have some potion that would prevent you from aging or would reverse the aging process, would you want it, or why or why not? And of course, recognizing that I'm looking at a group of folks who are not 21 years old, it's a slightly different question, but still, it's a valid question. How many people would take it or would have taken it had it been available at any point in their life?
Depends on the quality of life it would give.
Yeah.
I would take it as long as I could still be useful.
Okay,
Well, my career is I'm having more fun now working for Salvation Army than I had working.
those of you who didn't raise your hands, why not?
I'm still thinking about
You're still thinking about it. It's not available, but, you know, in the best of all possible worlds.
May I add to hers? I have MS since 2004, and the reason I would be open to that is because stem cells are a treatment now open to, not to live longer with MS, but to maintain where you are. And because of the treatment I have, I can work. And that makes me feel useful.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
What about those of you who say no?
Stem cells is a treatment for urticaria or for anything I would probably consider, but just to live longer.
Okay, all right, so, yes, as treatment. No, as life preserver. Okay, so these mirror what 18 to 21-year-olds say. There are some things that are a little different because they haven't had the life experience, certainly. But it's not, you know, some will say, well, why not? Yeah, woo! You know, more time, have fun. Or, you know, then I wouldn't, or theirs, of course, then I wouldn't have to get old. You know, some of us would say, I'm old, I like this. I want to stay old longer. So moving from this sort of personal piece, what are some of the ethical issues at play in what's going on in this article, or what's going on in the decision-making that you're doing? What are some of the ethical issues at play?
It's almost godlike.
Say again, Mike?
It's almost godlike.
Okay, so play a God.
I think to the question of quality of life. So there are a lot of medical treatments right now that are either being used for development that can prolong life, but maybe at great cost of quality of life.
Okay, so there's a quality sort of versus I'm just gonna use this word quantity. What else?
I'm dealing with outliving my children. I'm not sure I want to do that.
So is that an ethical issue?
I think it is.
How so?
Well, because in order for me to not outlive them, they would have to take the injection too. And one other reason, there are life choices they've made. And I can't protect them from those life choices.
No, I'm still looking for the ethical issue here, the bigger ethical issue.
Is losing a child.
That's a visceral issue, but not necessarily an ethical issue. Where's the right or wrong in what you're talking about?
I think it's wrong to live beyond when we're supposed to.
Okay, so in some respects, we're back to playing God.
Yeah.
Okay?
And there's some resource usage.
Pardon?
There's some resource usage. So
Yes.
if you're living endlessly, then those who would have taken your job, taken your food, taken your whatever,
Right.
you're using things that the next generation.
Right. Yeah, so there's the question of resources.
And who gets to decide?
Yep. Is it money?
Very much.
Is it status?
Oh,
You know, who gets to decide? That's an ethical issue.
Yeah.
Other pieces.
I don't know if this is ethical, but I do know this, watching my grandmother. She lived in 94, she was in great health, but the loss of her friends and her community before she passed.
Right, okay.
She felt, I don't have a commonality. And
Okay.
I don't see, I know it's probably not ethical, but,
Not really.
but-
It's just the way life works.
Yeah, she didn't have anybody to relate to when she was growing. I guess that,
Mhm.
I don't know.
So some of the other ones,
So I'm
Go ahead.
thinking too, what's the word? I can't find the right word. So like discrimination around who has medical access to this.
well, who gets to decide? Yeah, so the flip side is who has access.
Yeah, because, I might have access, because I'm white, middle class, I have some money.
Right.
My brown and black friends, not so much.
Right. Some of the other ones that were much more pertinent maybe 12 years ago when this article came out is the whole question, there's a question of stem cells. Because that was fought seriously because stem cells used to only be available through fetuses.
Right.
So the anti-abortion folks took that piece. Now they can be manufactured. So there's the whole question about manufacturing things like this. Okay, so there are any number of ethical issues that go on here, from displaying God to quality versus quantity. Is that, if you think about it in a different way about who has access in terms of money, is it worth money to pay to keep somebody alive? We think about the amount of money that's spent to keep people on ventilators and all these kinds of things when we know that they're brain dead. So there are a lot of different ethical issues. And of course, somebody already raised the question of who decides and on what basis.
Also, I have a friend whose sister has 4th round of brain cancer. She will die soon. They've given her a couple of months, but they said they could extend it by a month if she did this. Well, fair enough. She's decided to do this. But another piece of the ethics is, it now means that her mother and her sister, who's dealing with the kid with Down syndrome and a full-time job in life, have to continue to take care of all her stuff.
Right.
So it doesn't just affect the patient.
No, not at all.
So that's another piece of the ethics, is what does it do to your support system?
Right. So those are all good questions, all related to the ethics of it. Familial ethics are significant. You know, why do you favor one child over the other, pay for one child's college education and not the other child's college education? That's an ethical issue, for example, those kinds of things. And, you know, some people would say, well, it's just common sense. Well, common sense isn't common. There is no such thing as common sense. Because what's common sense, and we'll talk about this a little later, what might be common sense in the West, not common sense in the East, for example, or among first world people against third world people, or Westerners versus native folk. I mean, our common sense is just different. And so to appeal to that doesn't work, as Voltaire noted. So earlier in middle to the late part of the 20th century, a couple of ethicists, Tom Beecham, and it's pronounced Beecham, not Beauchamp, Beecham, and James Childress developed what they refer to as the principles of biomedical ethics. And they wrote a book, and that's what it's called. It's now, like, I think in its 4th or 5th edition, so it's been around a lot. And it is sort of the standard in the US and most of the West for how you think about things in terms of biomedical ethics. And it's in the broad strokes of it are called principlism. Isn't that great? Principlism. You'll see this in just a second. And they have 4 principles. And they will argue, or have argued, that these 4 principles are not in order of importance or consideration. You just have to start somewhere. You can agree or disagree with their defense when we're done. Okay, so principlism. And the first is respect for autonomy. All right? Respect for autonomy. And we see this in a lot of different ways. The issue is that, at root, the issue is you should be the person who makes the decision for you. Okay? You are an autonomous individual. You make decisions as you see it for you. Okay? Now, have any of you ever, I ask this question to students, because some of them say yes. Have any of you ever participated in a scientific study? Okay. And what did you have to do before you started participating?
Sign a release.
Sign a release. I know what I'm doing. That's the autonomy, right? I know what I'm doing. And so this one is clear. It has a lot of assumptions that we'll tease out a little bit as we go on. But respect for autonomy is the first one. All right, and we'll see how this works. Well, I'll give you examples. An example. You go, well, actually, the study is a good one, but if you go in for, you're hit by a car, and you go, or you're in a hospital and in a coma, and you need to have emergency medical care. You cannot be autonomous, right?
Sure.
So they look for next of kin who can stand in for you because you can't, who would be acting on your best behalf, right?
That's why you should have a medical director.
Yeah, yeah. In some respects that would work, but if you're on vacation someplace and the proverbial piano falls from the 7th floor, and you are hit. And you're rushed into New York General. Your medical directive in Colorado may take a while to get there. So respect for autonomy is the first of the principles. The second one is known as beneficence.
Beneficence.
Good. We make decisions based on the best sort of the best interest of folks, right? So if you could see it as the greater good, you know, the Millsian thing, but you think about this in the standpoint of the example that I just gave. You cannot find the next of kin. You're there on the table. The doctor has to make a decision. The decision is for the greater good, we're going to do what we can to keep you alive, regardless of what you may have a DNR someplace else. But for the greater good, we're going to do this. All right. The same thing works when we're talking about larger issues, social issues. Is, you know, will this serve society? So there's a cost-benefit analysis that goes on here. Let's say you're there, your arm has been crushed. If we don't amputate your arm, you're going to die. You cannot answer that question. The doctor will say, for the greater good, we'll amputate your arm, deal with it later. This is how we make these decisions. Okay. It goes back to some of these other issues that you've already raised, the greater good of whom? If it's not just an individual, but let's say it's a social issue. And we can think of any number of social issues that are before us, whether it's physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, depending on which language you want to use, whether it's abortion or capital punishment. We'll talk about these at the end, just so you can see how where the Episcopal Church sort of comes down on these and what rationale the Episcopal Church has used, right? You know, but the greater good for whom? All right, let's think about the criminal who's been convicted of a capital crime. The greater good for that person is not to give him a lethal injection. But the argument that gets made is that for the greater good of society, it is right to give him the lethal injection. Cost benefit. All right? That makes sense?
Yes.
Okay. The next one is called, I love this, non-maleficence. And it has nothing to do with cartoon characters in Beauty and the Beast. Sleeping Beauty is maleficent, yeah. It has nothing to do with that. Non-maleficence is the vow that doctors take to do no harm. Okay, so it's sort of the flip side of beneficence. In beneficence, you vow to do the best that you can in this situation. Non-maleficence is, I will not do harm, which many physicians have a problem with when they're called to assist in capital punishment. Because they have signed the Hippocratic Oath, says, I will do no harm. So states that want to use lethal injections for that sometimes have real problems finding medical professionals who will actually do that. So non-maleficence is yet another. So those three: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence. Number 4 is justice. Is it just? And you know, this goes back a little bit to the cost-benefit analysis, but it goes even further than that. There is a sense among folks, among most people, that there is an inherent worth for most people. Is this being just in terms of that inherent worth? And some people will draw a distinction between a variety of things. I love this cartoon. If you've never seen it before, distinguishes between equality, equity, and justice. Okay, equality is everybody gets the same stuff. So you can see these 3 people trying to see the game. They've all got the same box to stand on, but the short person still can't see the game. Okay? So equity is everybody gets what they need. So the tall guy gets nothing. The middle person gets enough to make her see over the fence. Short person gets double enough, so short person can see over the fence. Justice says, get rid of the barrier. Make sure that everybody has access without fiddling around with the things that might provide that access. Let's get rid of the barrier. So you could say in a social system, I'll use America as an example, that we have access to medical care at a certain level provided by virtue of being a taxpayer, let's say, and you could say that that's equality. But is it equity? No, because not everybody gets this. Is there a way to get rid of the barrier to medical care? You know, so that's so those are biomedical issues, right? And so all of these things sort of exist as we try and make some of these decisions moving forward. Thoughts or questions before I go on? Conundrum.
Complicated.
Complicated, okay?
I think autonomy is probably the most important thing for me. Because I have experienced being the primary executive, if you want, of three important people in my life: my father, my friend Marceline Dillon, and my husband. And my father was driven from Lutheran Hospital down to Mercy the day before he died because they thought he had cancer. And I kept saying, why are you worried about that? He's dying of pulmonary thrombosis. Why are you worried about it? And he, I don't know if he signed a release or not, probably they had him. But obviously the doctor's goal was to save his life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. But my husband took the choice when he was given the stage 4 cancer. I'm on quality medical committee.
Mm-hmm.
And that was interesting because his physician chose not to be his physician through hospice. They won't do it because they're gonna save lives. Whereas the hospice doctor was, and we didn't even have a date of Wally's life at the beginning when he got a traffic ticket for backing into a tree in a shopping center. And we had to go to court, and that's when it came out, it was 6 months. But that quality of life, his choice, was absolutely the right one for him, and I think for us.
So
Yeah.
moving from there, I want to go into some of these assumptions, and we can tease these out, but you're getting at one of them. And that piece of autonomy is, you missing one, Nikki?
No, I can't,
Oh, okay. There are only 4. The one about autonomy really points to sort of cultural biases. That we in the West, heirs of I think, therefore I am, heirs of all of that, have this idea that we as individuals are the culmination of everything, that it's all about me. I'm not arguing against that. I'm just saying that that's one of our cultural assumptions. There is another cultural assumption that contradicts that, and that is that societies, many societies, not just Western society, have this thing against suicide, which is a denial of autonomy.
Yes.
Which says you are more important, you as a cog in our social wheel than you are as a member, as an individual. So there's this assumption, this is a cultural assumption, that the individual is at the top. Now you go into some traditional cultures, and what's at the top? The family.
Yeah.
Doesn't make any difference what you want. You go to school and become a doctor because mom and dad want you to be a doctor. I don't care if you want to do dates. And I saw this a lot in colleges because we'd see students coming from international students, and it may have been that their country was paying for them to go to school, to learn to be an engineer or a physician or something like that, and they wanted to go into the arts or they wanted to study literature. And so, but their culture was such that their autonomy didn't matter. Okay, so there are cultural biases. This Western individualism is really a key one, and that shows up in some other ways here as well. Yeah, the Western individual. I'm trying to think of other cultural biases. Can you think of other cultural biases?
That deal with autonomy,
Pardon?
that deal with autonomy.
That deal with principalism at all, with autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence.
You embarrassed your family, therefore we're gonna kill you. Your family, we're gonna execute you.
Yeah. Honor killings,
Yes.
you know, perfectly justifiable in some countries. Certainly not here, you know. And whether you like honor killings or not, I'm not going to debate that right now. But that's a cultural assumption that principalism doesn't take into effect unless it says, you poor, benighted people in South Asia, you just need to learn the right stuff. And we have it. Thank you very much.
I think about, I don't know if it still happens, probably not, but the old stories about Eskimos and their old folks would go out onto an ice floe because they knew there was only so much food to go around and they lived their life. And that was, nobody went, oh no, you can't do that.
What's that? What was that book, Soylent Green? You know, there are a lot of dystopian books that really do point out the limitations of our cultural biases. You know, they're pretty depressing, but they are there. There are some other assumptions, and those are that this is very Western secular. Okay, Western secular. So I'll go to another example. So secularism versus religious interests, and we see these often enough. And many of you may remember, it shows up every so often, that, but there were famous set of court decisions having to do in the state of Washington with a child who needed, I think, blood transfusions to live. And his parents, who were Jehovah's Witnesses, said no, because they do not want blood transfusions based on their reading of scripture. How many different ethical issues are involved right there, especially given the US's theoretical stance on religious freedom? So who decides? Can't go to the principle of autonomy. Why? 3-year-old
Can't make that decision.
And if you go back to, of course, the question of autonomy, which I didn't raise before, is that I just used the image of somebody who was comatose, but you can use all sorts of other things, minors, people who aren't comatose, but who don't have the mental capacity to make a decision for themselves. That raises some interesting questions for the church, because the church has said at various points, and I still hear this from some folks, I don't want my children taking communion until they understand what's happening. How many of you understand what's happening in communion? Just say it. But, we base religious stuff on issues of autonomy. All right? So, kid can't decide because it's too young. So take out autonomy from that one. So what do we have left? We have beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Okay? So society in general would say it is in the best interest of the child to give the child that blood transfusion. Right? So beneficence reigns. To not know, who would be harmed if you're going to pull in the theory of non-maleficence or that category? Who would be harmed? Doctors would say nobody would be harmed. Is there a question of justice? Well, not really. So autonomy's out. So who's supposed to make the decision? The parents. But it doesn't look like they're making the best decision for the child based on Western secular ideas. We may agree with those in this case, but that's where this is a Western secular way of looking at things as opposed to looking at things through religious lenses. All right? Does that make sense? These things, these small vaccinations are another one.
Yes.
you know? Here, the greater good is that you get vaccinated. So beneficence is all about it. Who cares about autonomy? Get vaccinated, and we're gonna, we'll demand this as hard as we can. And in some places, wear your seatbelt. Best for everybody, and we will give you a ticket if you don't. You're perfectly welcome not to wear your seatbelt and get killed. You're perfectly welcome to not wear your seatbelt and get ticketed, and you will pay the, So we do impose things against autonomy. And we use beneficence, the greater good, as the argument for that. All right, so these things, is autonomy the number one issue in these principalisms, or does it fit and move? What is it? At what point can you make a decision? When are you old enough to decide? My college students love this. I'm going to tell the story and then I'll get to you.
Okay.
My college students, when I would tell them, I love this because, as you all know, I've worked for decades with college students. And we had, when I was in Berkeley, we had a living arrangement where we had a lot of international students. And one night, doing a program with them, I said, when do you become an adult? What is it that defines adulthood? And we went through all sorts of possibilities. Driver's license, voting, fiscal independence, having a child, moving out, being able to vote, being able to drink. What is it? Is it the actuarial tables that say when you're 26 you can rent a car? What defines an adult? And so I was sitting in this room with all these international students, and they had different things. And I remember this German kid. He said, "You Americans, you have it all wrong." He says, "You allow people to drive at 16, and you don't allow them to drink until they are 21. Therefore, they're all driving illegally drunk because they don't know what it's like. In Germany, you can drink early.
Yeah.
If you fall off your bike too many times, you know what to do when you get behind the wheel of a car." So, what is it to define, how do we define adulthood? And that has to do with autonomy. A 3-year-old, we probably would all agree. What about 12? 15? When the frontal lobe kicks in? Pardon? That's right, and then all of us are still trying to figure out what to do when we grow up. So, so it's a real question. Autonomy has these assumptions behind it, like we all know what it means. The common sense is the common.
Well, being raised Presbyterian, you became confirmed when you were 12 because you could make sense of it.
Right.
And that's also when Jewish kids had their Bible and stuff.
Yeah.
So it was the tide into it. So.
Yeah. There is that theory that when you hit puberty, really wacky theory. When you hit puberty, you're not an adult. No. But so basically when you hit child rearing, potential. So I mean we have all of these various ways, but this gets at autonomy, and it raises some questions about these Western assumptions. Because certainly bar mitzvahing and things like that, there's this religious overlay or confirmation, there's this religious overlay that says you're an adult at this point, which may or may not coincide with what the society says, or a secular society says. But there are other things that religion brings to consideration. Why do you get sick? Just why do you get sick? For any reason, why do you get sick? Why do you get COVID?
Because the body isn't functioning.
Pardon?
The body isn't functioning correctly.
Well, is that the reason you get sick, or is that a function of getting sick? Or both? It could be both. Okay? Yeah, your immune system is compromised, so therefore you get sick. Okay? Good scientific.
Little bug comes along and gets you sick.
Little bug comes along and gets you sick. Okay, so that's germs.
Yeah.
Good scientific, Western scientific What else?
To backpack on that, because you do,
Say again?
because you do get sick.
Yeah, but what
Just
caused
do.
that?
There you go. Your sins.
So what did you say?
Your sins.
Your sins. There we go. Exactly. Exactly. You have sinned and you've gotten sick. That's not going to fly with principlism. It's not going to fly, but it is a religious answer. Another possible answer that's cultural, not necessarily religious, although it could be, but we think that you've gotten sick because of germs. That's called an invasive force, which is also in the religious language called the demon.
Stress.
Pardon?
Stress.
Stress, yeah. Another.
So response to life situations.
Yeah. So there's another sort of rational area. But germs is an invasive force. That's demonic possession. Retribution. You're sick because you're an evil person. That's a religious answer that principlism doesn't answer. Doesn't give recourse to, right? And so there are, what happens to you after death?
So that just before we get to death, that brings up the question, the ethical question of should we be saving the lives of a killer or a Hitler or like you have to be a good person to get these nice little life.
Exactly. And that's a way of thinking about justice and in terms of these kinds of things. And other people would argue against that. But let's go on. I'm just mindful of time. Let's go on with what happens after you die. What part of you? Okay. So that you're between physicality and something else. All right.
God force.
All right. But that is in and of itself a religious or philosophical conviction.
Yes.
So what else happened? Let's say that you agree with that. What happens after you die?
Everything stops.
Everything stops. That's a medical issue. That's a Western scientific issue. Are you reincarnated? Did you go to the land of the shades? Are you resurrected?
Good questions.
Those three things. Or do you just sort of rot and die? You just die, and you're composted and you become something else. Those four things represent different considerations if you're going to make a decision on life or death issues for someone. If you think that death is the doorway to heaven, then why prolong anybody's life? They get to go be with Jesus. If you think that death is the doorway to reincarnation, you might want to be alive as long as you can to make sure that you don't come back as a sea star. Okay? If it's just the cessation of your bodily functions, and that leads to a different kind of conclusion. So these, what one researcher calls religious umbrellas, need to sort of take into account when you're making some of these decisions. And principlism doesn't do that. Principlism doesn't take into account cultural differences. It doesn't take into account religious differences. It's a Western secular way of making sense of dilemmas presented by our biomedical kind of condition as human beings. So that's how the West thinks about it. And you'll find references to principlism in other countries as well, mostly Western countries. But if you believe in demon possession, this doesn't work. Doesn't work so well in, let's say, Africa, where they still believe really, vigorously, in demon possession. And that what you really want to do when someone's sick is call an exorcist, right? Or another example, again, not necessarily religious, but cultural, even to this day, and it was in the West until the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, is why did you get sick? Your humors were out of balance.
Yeah.
Right?
That's where it was.
Still the case in China. They will tell you what foods to eat to get your hot, cold, moist, dry back in balance. Different kind of language, but you find these in Greek and Roman texts, that this is how you're going to get better. And so when your humor's out of balance, O-U-R, humors. Okay. Phlegmatic, in the West, it was the phlegmatic, sanguine. These were the humors that So that went away, basically, for the most part in the West, with the onset of modern medicine in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So these are all there as part of how we make decisions. And I just want to spend the last little bit giving some examples of how where this fits with three different issues that the Episcopal Church has weighed in on over time, messy issues, abortion, euthanasia, and the death penalty. Okay, so abortion, if you just think about this, I mean, you've all heard the arguments for and against abortion, right? So whose autonomy can be considered? Well, really only the mother's, right? But when you think about beneficence, whose good is greater? That's where some of the debate. Non-maleficence, that one's really, really thorny because somebody's might not make it out of there, right?
That's right.
So if a physician is involved, where is that going to happen? And if you think about justice, how does that fit in? What we're going to be debating with Roe v. Wade going on, there's a lot of justice issues floating around in there, along with the others. So here's a very, very prominent one. So here, and I got all these from, I know you probably can't read it, I'm sorry, but I wanted to get as much of it up there as I could. So here's what the Episcopal Church has done with abortion, and this is sort of a summary that I found online. In a series of statements over the past decades, churches declared, we emphatically oppose abortion as a means of birth control. Okay? Family planning, sex selection, of any reason of mere convenience. And they're arguing out of the basis of the sanctity of life, right? At the same time, since 1967, and I've highlighted this in yellow, the Episcopal Church has maintained its unequivocal opposition to any legislation on the part of the national state which would abridge or deny the right of individuals to reach informed decisions, autonomy.
That's right.
Okay? And then down at the bottom, we continue to advocate, and the middle paragraph, equitable access to women's health care, including women's reproductive health care, integral part of all of this, dignity and work. They're making an argument here of justice coming out of our baptismal covenant, right? We continue to advocate that legislating abortions will not address the root of the problem. We therefore express our deep conviction any proposed legislation regarding abortions must take special care to see that individual conscience, autonomy, is respected, and that the responsibility of individuals to reach informed decisions in this matter is honored. So here, sanctity of life, or going to the scriptural texts about sanctity of life, is being modified a little bit by the Episcopal Church. It's using three-legged stool, scripture, tradition, and validating reason here in this one, right? So those principles are there. There's justice there, and there's autonomy there, but the church is arguing at the root out of scripture and sanctity of life. And then saying things have changed, we've got to deal with some of these other things as well. Okay? Euthanasia, or physician-assisted suicide, whatever you want to call it. Since 1991, passed a resolution against assisted suicide, saying it's morally wrong and unacceptable to take a human life in order to relieve the suffering caused by incurable illness. Okay? So we can't take a life even if you're suffering. Right? That was what they originally claimed. At the same time, this ethics professor says, there's a sense within the church that hard and fast rules on end-of-life issues may not fit every circumstance. So here we have the rules coming out of the church, out of scripture and tradition. But reason is presenting another consideration. All right? So the church also teaches it's justified to stop medical treatment, including artificial nutrition, when that treatment brings significantly more burdens than benefits to a people, or to an individual, to a person. So here's the question of beneficence. What's the greatest good to that individual? And if that individual says the greatest good for me is I am sick and tired of being sick and tired.
That's right.
Autonomy is saying, let me go. And the church has said, we're not going to let you give them a shot, but we'll let you not continue to feed or let them have water. So I'm not saying we should agree with any of this, but this is how the church has been thinking about some of these issues. And principlism shows up in them sort of as a consideration if you know what to look for, how to read these decisions. And then the last one is death penalty. Way back in 58, resolution, taking of human lives falls only within the providence of the Lord, not within that of humans. So for 65 years, the position of the church has been against the death penalty. And this, came in support of a movement among states to abolish capital punishment individually. Then this continues to go on. The church's commitment to the Christian doctrine of redemption in the intrinsic value of life. So here's the religious reason, is because if you kill somebody, you've stopped them from being able to repent. And that the openness of the church, of the mercy of God, should be there until the very end, and that's God's decision, not society's decision. All right? So you can go through and you can just sort of Google Episcopal Church death penalty, and you'll get the links to all of these kinds of things, or euthanasia, or any of these sorts of issues that we've been talking about. But I wanted to just sort of point out where at least this church stands. Other churches don't stand in the same way, in the same place. They'll say the judgment of God is this, it's revealed in Scripture, and so therefore, chop off their head or something like that. That's different way. So there we go. 50 minutes. How to make bioethical decisions. You're now experts. Okay? As long as you remember autonomy, beneficence, non-beneficence, and justice, and think about how you play these things through when you're reading in the paper. And it's very interesting to see what arguments are being put forth, if you know how to tease them out. I had a class, I'm going to stop with this. I had a class when I was in college. It was a required class in logic.
Oh, I did that. Yeah.
And it was taught by somebody who didn't really know it, and he was assigned to teach it. And we had a textbook that had 31 chapters, and we had a 10-week quarters, 3 classes a week. We read a chapter and did the exercises one a day. Because that was, and I hated that class. Everybody hated that class. But I did learn logical fallacies and how to make arguments and how to dissect arguments and all of those kinds of things. And that was so important. So knowing these helps you sort of go into some of these arguments. You realize there's some problems with that argument. That's a Western argument. It doesn't work all over. Where does that fit with this? And to be able to sort of have interesting conversations with folks that you might not have otherwise. Questions?
I just say thank you. I do appreciate that the Episcopal Church is open to respecting scientific research, and there's reason, if I'm kind of, I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that
questions.
Yeah. That is, part of the church's heritage is we say reason. We account for that. But it's modified, of course, for the church by Scripture and tradition. And it's not all reason, because we can see that everything that is purely rational has real problems when it comes into conflict with other considerations, whether it's cultural or religious or those kinds of things. So, and as a nation, where we are a multinational, multicultural, multi-religious nation, it becomes really, really problematic. So I didn't close the loop. Of course, the state of Washington said, give that kid a blood transfusion. We are declaring that kid a ward of the state, which gave them the permission to make the next of kin decision for that child, taking it away from parents, saying that this is in some respects child abuse and removing the child. So that was their argument. Now, if the adults don't want to, then they can make their own informed autonomous decision and they can, refuse the vaccination or the transfusion. But they know what they're doing. But they cannot force that on a 3-year-old. Yeah. So anyway, just to close that, I should have said that, and that has gone to the Supreme Court and has stood that. So there, society, it's still against the law to kill yourself. I don't know what they're going to do to you if you do, but I've always been confused by that. But societies say that you are worth more to us as a society than you are to yourself, and that's a very interesting issue to sort of think through. Who declares what your individual worth is? Do you? Does society? Does God? Does something else? And there are no easy answers. So there you go. Happy Father's Day. Anyway, I don't get to do this anymore because the guy I did it for is retired. He doesn't teach the class. So this may be the last time I've given this lecture. But if you got any questions, let's go ahead and close up. Mike, you have any questions?
I have several, but I'll email them to you.
Okay. Anyway, everybody, thanks so much. Go home, celebrate Father's Day.
Thank you, Father. Good lesson.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to see either of my children. I guess I'll see my son this afternoon. Although he's leaving and going off and spending the rest of the day with his friends. So.